Well, without much further ado, I don't know if everyone's aware, but we have switched out some speakers. Um, Pamela has graciously agreed to give her talk later on in the month, and Keith Runyon is available today to speak with us in what was originally Pamela's slot. He's going to be speaking on, and I'm sure I won't get exactly the title right, but as I understand it, it's values, economics, and the environment from your perspective at Quaker Earthcare Witness. So without further ado, I hand it over to Keith in beautiful Chico, California.
Thank you so much, Rory. And thank you, everyone. Um, it's wonderful to be here today, and um, it's fun to, I think, I'm here to speak about economics, and I may be one of the only folks here whose degree is in neuroscience, not in economics, and whose work is in environmental efforts. But anyways, some of you might not know that my position is as the General Secretary, Director of Quaker Earthcare Witness, which is the largest network of Quakers who's working on environmental earth care issues, and who the largest international Quaker organization whose core focus, sole focus, is environmental work. And so we're a small but growing organization. I think we'll have 4 staff by the end of the year, it looks like. We're currently running at 2. But we do work all around the world through our mini grants program and work with the United Nations and CUNO. Um, and actually, we just got word back, unfortunately, that we're the side event that we were hoping to put on in Bonn, Germany for the subsidiary body's 62 climate conference, that it didn't, our side event was not approved. Um, but I'll be up there visiting with Lindsay, and that's one of the reasons I'm headed to Europe this summer, which I understand most of you, this is mostly a Swiss Central European group, is my that's the impression I've been given. Um,
UK and Netherlands and Central Europe. And I hope I didn't leave
okay.
anybody out. Oh, Boston. No, Philadelphia. Sorry, Pam's in Philadelphia.
UK, of course.
And a big contingent from the UK.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I knew Pamela was from Philadelphia, of course, but it's really great, yeah, to be here with you all. So I want to talk about our to kind of rediscuss the foundations of how we're coming at economics. And I'm not expecting fundamentally that we're going to bring in some new concepts into our economic frameworks here. I think that you all are probably fairly well versed. Um, but I'm going to start our conversation not in the Quaker values of, say, simplicity or integrity, but actually in the Quaker value of peace, and look at the intersection of how peace relates to the environment and the economy. And so to kind of get that started, I want to open with a piece from our 2022-2023 annual report that I think speaks to QEW's perspective on these matters. So as we witness the escalation of warfare the world over, QEW has been called to deepen its engagement in ministry regarding the intersections of earth care and global peacemaking. We strongly believe that there can be no peace on earth without peace with earth, and conversely, that there can be no peace with earth without peace on earth. The two are inseparable. We must tame and transmute the flame of human conflict and ecocide if we are to bring about a life-giving future for our species and the web of life. Such a transformation will require unprecedented global cooperation and solidarity, and warfare is the antithesis of such unity. We are now, as a species, too powerful to remain in rivalry with ourselves. To achieve a genuine world beyond war, we will need to address the root causes of war, eliciting campaigns for global healing, reconciliation, and transformative justice that redress our deepest wounds and the systems that perpetuate them. Only through this profound transformation within and amongst ourselves can we become, on net, a regenerative species within the web of life. So I want to take a moment for those words to sink in. So I want to begin today's talk by discussing how I see the relationship between the uh, warring, rivalrous aspects of our species, and its relationship between that and the economies that have evolved into the modern era. Um, so the fundamental thing I want to introduce, the contention I want to start with, is the idea that rivalry is deeper than capitalism. So the fundamental notion here, why would I say that? Why is rivalry deeper than capitalism? Aren't the two obviously interconnected and self-reinforcing? This is my um, pointing at this is not trying to say that they're not self-reinforcing. I think that they are, and there's a cycle there. But that the reason why we have developed the kind of economic system we have today is because it maximizes, um, it optimizes for uh, most effective inward cooperation, outward power projection, i.e., the is able to mount an extremely effective military industrial complex. And that societies for the last 10,000 years or so that were more capable of producing highly effective military industrial complexes or pre-industrial complexes, as it were, have outcompeted and shaped history more effectively than societies that were more peaceful. And we can see this countless times throughout the historical record that, say here in the Americas, societies that were less war-like were decimated by, societies that were able to, that were more extractive from nature, more able to take those rich forms of value that are uh, hard to boil down to metrics in the form of, like, say, a living forest, and boil them down into timber, which is a highly fungible, commodifiable form of value that is able to create strategic advantage, but is actually debasing the fundamental values and fundamental well-being of all. And that's, of course, a fundamental trap that we enter into, which I think is at the center of sort of how history has unfolded and the reason why we're in such a nasty situation today, which is mostly that unbounded zero-sum competitions are almost always negative sum. And this is because the odds that the optimum competitive advantage, what works towards optimum competitive advantage in that system is just so happens to be precisely coordinated or precisely aligned with what creates optimum systems health is approaches zero as you get into a more and more complex system. And so what happens when we, try to increase the competitive power of our economy or something like that is we end up debasing any value that is not competitive advantage value, that is not dollar value, that is not, the ability to mount these kinds of complexes. So what ends up happening is the pursuit of local maximums in this happens at the level of cities this is the race to the bottom dynamic in economics to countries and arms races that, no country on Earth thinks a world with more nuclear weapons is a better world, but we all race towards a world with more nuclear weapons nonetheless. And the same thing is true with artificial intelligence. And so, unless we're able to solve the human rivalry problem, unless we're able to fundamentally transform a dynamic that has shaped our species for thousands of years, um, we will be locked in the same cycles that produce these types of world systems. And whether it's a communist world system that's able to mount an effective military industrial complex or a capitalist world system that's able to mount a effective military industrial complex, the ones that are going to win are those that are able to mount such a complex until we deal with the fundamental drivers of rivalry and competition amongst human beings and move towards a deeper peacemaking. So in this way, I want to make the argument to all of us here that peacemaking is actually the foundation of being able to move towards a more regenerative, more renewable form of economics. And that until we do that, it's mostly just theory because it will never be politically and international, like geopolitically, viable. Um, so there's a lot of layers to this, and I think some of you all might be familiar with Durkheim's concept of anomie, the breakdown of social norms and social order. And I think that the flip side of that might be what might call solidarity, which is not just sort of a negative piece or absence of conflict, but a deep um, sense of not just cooperation, but shared, principled, value-based cooperation, where we all agree, for instance, that we're globally going to cooperate amongst ourselves and we're going to try to, interact with the world in a wiser way. And I would say that the number one thing that I'm interested in increasing in the world is global solidarity. I think that that's the pathway out of the situation that we're currently in. And everything that falls short of that um, sometimes can win short-term wins, but if it doesn't fundamentally increase the degree to which humans are willing to cooperate with one another, in the long term, there will be backlashes, there will be other forms of conflict that essentially reverse any short-term gains that are able to be made. So there's the fundamental challenge, I think, is trying to move towards this. Um, and I think that the challenge is of profound importance. So you all probably would guess this based on the fact that feel spiritually led to work as the director of Quaker Earthcare Witness. But I certainly sense that we live in an existential moment. Back here in the States, I often say that we live in prophetic times. And by that, I mean that we're at the crux of history and that we're at a point wherein um, if we don't radically mature on the global stage, we will face the consequences of our immaturity. And it won't just be us that are impacted. We will decimate life on this planet for longer than our species has existed. And I think that the moral consequences of that is something that we did not evolve to comprehend. Our brains fail to comprehend even, slight large numbers in terms of moral weighting. And when we think about, geologic time and the level of damage that we are wrecking on the Earth, and when we move past a merely anthropocentric lens and start to see all of life as sacred, I think that one cannot not face the gravity of our circumstances and the responsibility we have as Quakers to do something about them. So, my hope in talking to you all, I sometimes say that I believe that there's something in Friends that is waiting to wake up. And I'm hoping that that's stirring in all of you as I'm speaking today. So, there's a lot of ways in which I think that sort of moving towards a more um, a world that uh, exemplifies greater global solidarity, like what we can do in that direction. Obviously, there's whole fields in the study of peace building and peacemaking, and economics is very much tied up in if you don't have just fair economies, the odds that those economies are also peaceful or those societies are also peaceful becomes very slim. Um, Even if you could describe that as peace, which is another matter. Um, but I want to get into what I think is some of what we're called to here. And I think over the next little bit, I would like to just kind of call out some of the dynamics that I've seen in Quaker communities that I think maybe we need to, I'll just say it, to grow out of a little bit. And um, so fundamentally, I think that we have one thing that Quakers have, and I think any of the world's sort of spiritual traditions have at their best, is the kind of work that we're doing, grounding ourselves in a much deeper um, historical legacy, has the power, if we are able to approach that in a way that is pluralistic yet honoring of its own tradition. I think that there's that in and of itself has a role in global peacemaking, and that as we're thinking about these things, if it's not just that peacemaking is this sort of absence of conflict, but some presence of value, presence of values, that the framework that Quakerism provides towards, I think, a religion that's centered on listening to our conscience, the process of listening and the process of listening to a deeper inward voice. Um, that has a really powerful place in what we're asked to do, and it's one language that I think that unifying messages can be built out of. I think that the responsibility of all the world's traditions is to come up with its own language, but I think that we have a responsibility to use ours in a way that can increase the degree to which we are centering values in the way that we're cooperating. So the John Woolman used to say that conduct is more convincing than language. And I think that one of the most important things that we will need to do in our times, if we're serious about trying to unite people, that, cultures that have had thousands of years, hundreds of years to have every good reason to think that they shouldn't trust their neighbor, right? Like if we aren't going to come at these sorts of problems in this sort of finger waggy, well, be peaceful kind of way, as opposed to this much deeper recognition of how deep those wounds are and a willingness to engage with them um, and understand why people feel that they need militaries, understand why people think that they need um, uh, defense contractors or warfare. Why there's if we can come at it and understand the fear that underlies those things, I think that we're starting on the right path. Um, but that in order to fundamentally undermine that fear, some of you all might be familiar with David Hartsoe, the founder of the Nonviolent Peace Force, a Quaker from the United States, and involved in many different, huge figure in the peace movement, died just a couple weeks ago. And one of the things that one of the stories from his life that most influenced me was a story from his life in the sit-ins in the 1960s. And he had been at a lunch counter for 3 days, getting hit, drinks thrown on him, berated, etc., with others and refusing to leave. And on the third day of his time uh, in your in the sit-ins movement, in that particular sit-in, the American Nazi Party showed up, and a man came up behind David and took out a knife and pressed it into his back and said, "If you don't leave now, I'm going to kill you." And David turned and looked at him and he said, "Friend, you're going to do what you think is right, and I'm going to do what I think is right. But whatever you choose, I'm going to try and love you." Conduct is more convincing than language. And I think that if we are serious about trying to elicit the kinds of campaigns, we're going to need to do what David did on that micro level, on a much more macro level. We're going to need to display moral leadership that shocks the conscience of people the world over. And I think Quakers, maybe more so than almost any other tradition on the planet, have the courage, the spiritual grounding, and the tradition to support that kind of spiritual courage, which I think is the foundation of building the kind of solidarity, to exemplifying the kind of solidarity that um, needs to come to exist in the world, and is the foundation for building a new type of world system and economic system that's fairer and more just to all. So, um, there's a whole bunch of things here, and one thing I wrote down was talking about transpolitical narratives, and I think that one thing that we can really focus on is trying to reduce the degree to which we unnecessarily um, solidify ourselves into a camp, um, uh, be it like a leftist using highly leftist language or socialist language or whatever camp that you're in. The if we want to um, build broad-based movements, we need to find language that works for a wide array of people. And I want to encourage folks to um, seek out that kind of language and to center that language in the way that you communicate with others, and center a much humbler approach to um, across political divides. Um, but I also think that building towards the kind of world economic system, one of the things I was really sitting with as I was kind of preparing for this is there's a whole bunch of things that we could talk about here about the way in which to build an international economy that's fair and more just. And whether that's, a global debt jubilee or moving towards, you know, there's radical proposals more on like the end of degrowth or trying to simply, create loss and damage funds and debt for climate swaps or other things of that sort. The There's an enormous amount that needs to be done there. But the thing is that none of those reforms mean anything. They're not durable, they're not robust, and they're not enforceable unless they sit at the forefront of mass political movements. And these movements will need to be transnational. Right now, we face an incredible ethno-nationalist headwind. It's winning in a lot of ways. It's the antithesis of the kind of cooperation, the kind of movement that we need to be building. Um, uh, but it's resultant from the kind of fear that has shown up in the kind of inequalities that our international system so far has created. Um, and so we need to be thinking about not just what our sort of minimum viable architecture is that could um, uh, effectively enforce, say, international court of justice rulings on ecocide. Because if we don't actually have the US and China and Russia as, signers on the International Court of Justice, it doesn't really matter much that there are rulings. Um, so we need to build that fundamental support. And then we need to build out the fundamental basis of an effective world um, an effective governance, international governance system that is robustly supported by major powers, um, and hopefully is radically reformed in the direction of actually being somewhat truly democratic as opposed to radically unfair. Um, but I think that what I want to center us on is that building out that support is there's a top down and bottom up dynamics that we need to be doing, right? We do need to like create these move towards these policy shifts. But if we're not simultaneously building the grassroots movements the world over that support said policy shifts, um, we're basically just setting ourselves up for a long-term pushback that sets us backward. So I think that we really need to build out that fundamental basis of support, and then we can talk more about what the underlying architecture is that's able to enforce and keep international actors adherent to global rules, and then on top of that, what those rules might be. um, anyways, there's multiple levels there. Um, so the some of the things I'm really hoping for us to avoid, I want to start with a challenge. And the major aspect of that challenge is I think that there's many people who have looked very hard at the economy and at the world situation and have basically come to the conclusion, somewhat rationally, that we're in for a I don't know, I'm gonna use a curse word, but we're in a downward spiral, in a very, collapse is very much ahead of us. Um, And I think that there's a lot of good reason to think that. But I think that one thing that shows up from that space is something that I actually really want to push back against, which is a tendency among some friends that I've met when they see the that collapse is coming. They're saying, the system's going down. It might as well go down. It was a terrible system to begin with. We're going to just focus on building up afterwards from the ashes. We're going to just build our eco village out, and when the system comes down, we're going to build that up, and then we're going to remake the world. And not only do I think there's often an enormous amount of naivety in terms of what it would take to actually scale a new way of relating, that might be inside that bubble of that eco village, to actually getting international cooperation behind doing peoples across the world to actually consider taking on that lifestyle. It's not just going to happen because collapse happened, I don't think. Um, but there's also, I think, profound callousness that I think comes from it, which is this basically whatever happens to the people in that collapse and the more than human world in that collapse is something that I'm not trying to do anything to solve or to try to care about. And that I find to be bordering on detestable, to be honest. I think that's something that we need to fundamentally challenge in ourselves, and that the the moral crisis of how many people who had nothing to do with the problem that was created who would die horrendous deaths from that form of collapse, and how many species would be lost. Because if you're talking about economic global collapse, you're probably talking about nuclear warfare. And you're also talking about climate change in the context of nuclear warfare. Um, it's not a pretty picture. And I think that we have a responsibility to do everything we can to soften that landing. We also have a responsibility to think about what we're going to do afterwards, because there's probably some truth in the fact that some of this system does need to come down. But I think that the kind of way of relating to it that we need to encourage amongst Quakers is one of engagement rather than disengagement. And that's what our consciences call us to do. So I'm a little skeptical of bubble projects. Let's create the next world system in our little bubble in this privileged community over here, unless they have a very clear idea of how they're going to use that to influence the broader system writ large. So I guess I'll finish by talking about how I see the transition. So if we are serious about engaging the system rather than just kind of wanting it to accelerate into collapse and then trying to rebuild afterwards, um, then I think that there's triage work we have to do, there's transitionary work and transformational work that we have to do. And one of the things I'd like to encourage folks to avoid is seeing those types of work in conflict with one another. I think that on the academic left, we're particularly prone to this. Um, and there's part of me that was gonna create a slideshow for today. I was just like, you know what, I didn't have time to pull it all together. So I have a few slides here that I was working on. Um, but there's the kinds of work that we're talking about here when we're talking about sort of triage work, transitionary work, and transformational work. I'm kind of defining those. Triage work exists in our current political reality. It's like what's actually winnable in current political circumstances that we live in. Maybe it's still optimistic in those circumstances, but it's not like radically outside of politically viable. um, Transitionary work is what's possible in movement reality. If a sort of historic movement were to arise, what kinds of policies could we create from that? And then transformational work is this kind of stuff of like post a radical paradigm shift broadly across humanity. What kind of economics can we build there, right? And there's a lot of really cool stuff that we could do if we radically cooperated better than we did and we were radically more trustworthy. I think gift economics is actually a beautiful idea, so long as you have people who are um, trustworthy enough to engage in a gift economic system where bad actors aren't exploiting people. Um, so one of the things I really want to encourage is I think a lot of times these three different types of work that some people on this side, the transformational side, think that the people who are doing the triage work are um, complicit or in some way, you know, uh, not pure enough, right? They're working on a loss and damage fund, and they're like, if you were really about trying to save people, you wouldn't believe that this was going to do anything. You have to, we're not 100% down the pathway of everything on this side of the economics. Then what we're really doing is some sort of greenwashing or some sort of, false solutions. And I think that the kind of movement solidarity we need to build is one that understands that all three of these need to be happening all at once and that they're not in conflict with one another, but they're mutually self-reinforcing. And we need to have less debates about with people on one side of this saying, the people in the transformational work are just unrealistic. They don't they're not living in reality or something like that. And pointing fingers in that direction. Human nature it just wouldn't work with human nature or something like that. And then on the other side, I'm as a neuroscientist, I'm actually relatively optimistic that given radically different social conditioning, not that human nature is not infinitely pliable, but I think it's pretty radically flexible. And that's actually kind of our evolutionary inheritance. Um, on the other side, the transformational folks accusing the triage folks of not being radical enough. I think that both of those kinds of things need to end, and they're both detrimental to the movement. So, the kind of world that I'm trying to walk us towards is one where we're moving towards uh, using the kind of work that's at the forefront of, say, I mean, the UN is in deep right now with the loss of US funding, et cetera. But if the SDGs and other things like that can be a bridge towards the kind of regenerative economy that we need to be going towards, I think that's the direction we need to get behind. And I think that some of us are going to need to stomach the fact that right now, um, I'm very much in support, in theory, of sort of proposals like degrowth. I think that our current economic size may be larger than is necessary for, and is maybe actually unoptimal for planetary health. Um, but the right now, I stomach that with a knowledge that the number one predictor of whether an incumbent will lose an election right now is whether economic growth decreases during their term. And that's true pretty much the world over. And so if we're being realists, we have to at some level swallow the fact that we are needing to move in that we're going to need to go through a period where we're convincing more and more people that a path of degrowth is possible and not fundamentally damaging to them. And obviously, that's partially a policy basis around redistribution, et cetera. Um, but also building the political will where redistribution isn't a pipe dream, but we actually have the political force to execute that. Um, and uh, and so I think that there's a lot of I think in the present there's a lot of ways in which we need to be building out things to lessen the impact of climate um, chaos, to radically curtail the artificial intelligence arms race that's happening in this moment, which I think is deeply threatening to is basically guinea pigging the planet, um, and trying to reduce nuclear arsenals and trying to radically move the world system in a much more equitable direction. Um, but there's a long game there, and I want to encourage us to say, what are the stepwise approaches that we do to building the kind of policies and support for those policies such that that transition is possible. And we probably, we might still face collapse. We might still face some incredibly profoundly difficult things because, that's the situation we're headed towards in many ways. But the more we can do to build that kind of solidarity now and to build towards policies that reduce the harm that is in front of us, those are life-saving measures. And they're also the kind of measures that build the foundation post-collapse if we're headed in that direction, which I think is likely but not inevitable, um, for the kind of solidarity that will need to exist after that. So, I think that's my presentation. I would be happy to take sort of questions, comments, harsh pushback, whatever you may have for me. Um, and um, and we can kind of get into the details here. And then we have some questions afterwards that we can focus in on as a group. But I think we were going to do Q&A and then the queries. Yeah. Yeah, Arn.
Hi, Keith. Thanks a lot for your words. It's just what I needed tonight. Especially what spoke to me. A lot of what you said speaks my mind, friend. And what spoke especially to me was this transnational aspect that you brought in. And my question would be, how does um, Quaker Earth Witness in the US want to go about that? Do you have any plans, any vision for that?
Quaker Earthcare Witness in the U.S. I don't represent the United States, of course. So, but yeah, QEW is working really hard right now to protect the gains in the Inflation Reduction Act, which, for those who don't know, I actually didn't know this when I first started working on it, but it's not just the largest U.S. climate bill in history. It's actually the world over, China, EU, et cetera, the largest climate bill to be passed. And um, it's set to keep about a gigaton of carbon dioxide if all the measures in it were kept out of the atmosphere by 2030, which, to kind of put that in perspective, is uh,
5% of global
uh,
emissions.
yeah, it's a large percentage of global emissions, and it's also based off basic um, carbon mortality math. We're talking about millions of lives per gigaton. of CO2 entering the atmosphere. So, um, and that's just the time between here now and 2030. There's an enormous, it's actually more than a gigaton. It's 300 to 400 megatons is just two of the measures per annually that are kept out of the atmosphere, the 48 aspects of the US tax code. And so we're talking immense potential for reducing enormous human suffering and ecological loss if those measures are kept, as opposed to if they're um, dismantled. And what's remarkable is that because of some rather clever engineering of that bill, 21 congressional Republicans in the United States in a House of Representatives that has a balance of power of 213 to 220 are actually the Republicans. 21 Republicans are working to defend a lot of those measures. And it's because the infrastructure that was built was massively oriented towards Republican districts. Um, and so it's like over 80% of the investment was in Republican districts, over 80% of the jobs that were created, over 80% of the economic benefits that were created. And so that was very smart engineering of that bill. I can get into why that is, but it may, it's created a realistic pathway where somehow Republicans will fight with Democrats under the Trump administration to try to protect some really core aspects of the tax code. And right now, Trump's obviously coming after the rule of law and, has canceled a lot of the grants, but a lot of this is actually baked in the tax code, not grants that Trump can easily cancel. Um, and so it's a really fundamental strategic push that we're making. Um, but in a larger sense, what QEW is hoping to do is build out the first map network and database of Quaker environmental action worldwide, which would include anyone who's on this call. We're going to actually have an individual story section that's going to be built out in connection to friends meetings, et cetera, where you can be linked up to others who are doing work similar to what you're doing the world over. And we're hoping to create things like um, faithfulness groups. And Pamela and I were just talking about this last night. But anyways, we're really trying to build out that to increase the coordination and efficacy of Quaker movement actions worldwide and lay the foundation for the kind of more prophetic movement building that we're hoping to create in the future. But yeah, the US is one aspect of it. I think the most I can figure out how to do is win this particular legislative battle here so that the world doesn't feel complete. If we keep these laws, if we kept most, even half of them, there's still viable pathways for the US re-entering some of its Paris goals. And so um, it's a really vital move. Obviously, it's a huge roll of the dice whether or not we have fair elections in 2028 or if moderately sane candidate wins them. But I think that we're working one step at a time, and this is what we're trying to offer to the world. When I hope that the EU, that you guys, if or wherever you're at, that if the U.S. is backing out of a lot of this, so other nations are going to need to step up. And the more that, it's been inspiring to see some ways in which there's been a Trump backlash, say in Canada or Australia. And I'm really hoping that you all will be a part of supporting the fragmentation of our international cooperative systems. Does that answer your question, Arn? And I wish I had like a whole bunch of specific information about things you could be doing in various parts of the world. I probably don't. um, that's what we're doing here in the US. Rory?
I was thinking of the whole rivalry thing that you started off with and struck with how for a period of time there, it seemed that everybody wanted to be greener than everybody else, whatever that meant. I mean, I think that when green meant growth, people were very happy to be as green as possible. But green, when it comes to degrowth, is not so popular. And so how do we I mean, since we're probably not going to get rid of rivalry, how do we make green sexy again?
Gosh, I feel a little bit, I was just thinking about like not being about the complicity kind of thing. And when I think about making green sexy, there is a part of my stomach that kind of turns a little bit because I'm like, we need something so much deeper than that. And I think there is something about holding this deeper value and living it in your own life around, say, minimalism, simplicity, and the willingness to make sacrifices, the willingness to have a much deeper orientation, but also to say, simultaneously, we need to build buy-in in a larger sense from people who are maybe not ready for that. Um, and yeah, I think that there's a lot of ways, for instance, with solar. Solar, you hear Trump talking a lot about how bad windmills are, but it's harder to convince everyday people that solar is bad. And one of the reasons why is because it's just economically makes an enormous amount of sense. B, there's it offers up energy security and energy independence for not just like a country, but individuals can build microgrids. So, even these kind of Republicans who are kind of, or in the US, we call them Republicans, people who are more oriented towards distrust of sort of the centralized systems and want to kind of live back on the land in whatever sense of the word, um, which is often left-wing folks. Um, but the people who are oriented in that direction, solar is actually profoundly supportive of that kind of transition. Um, so I think that that work is already being done by a lot of companies, et cetera, that are, China's making extraordinary EVs, so much so that the US is frightened of them. Um, the There's a lot being done to kind of do that, decoupling kind of work. Um, and I think that mostly I see our role as um, challenging people to go further than that, but not shaming people for where they're at. I think that's how I see it. I don't personally, I don't feel I like to demonstrate that green lifestyles can be really joyful. And I think that's the main role that us as Quakers have, that there's a deeper meaning that one obtains from not um, this sort of basic hedonistic orientation, but a much more holistic and morally grounded way of approaching life that leaves you when you reach the end of it feeling fulfilled rather than fun like an emptiness that you're trying to cover up for most of it. And I think that much deeper satisfaction, much deeper joy is something we need to be modeling in the world and be patterns and examples of.
Well, if there aren't any, oh,
I think
there's
Ron's got a
Ron.
question. You're on mute, Ron.
You've covered quite a lot of ground there, Keith. Um, I'm just wondering, everybody talks about the economic system as being a complex system, and we all know the advantages and disadvantages of complex systems. Um, they can unravel very rapidly. Um, they can also be influenced by small changes if you find the right touch point. Have you been able to identify any particular touch points that you think would be worth really focusing on? There's so many different things one can do that may or may not have have effects in their own right. Maybe there's a few things that one could do which would have large knock-on effects through loops, positive feedback loops within the system. And I'm wondering if you've thought about any of those elements.
Yeah. I think the number one thing that when we're dealing with complex three-body problem kind of systems is actually not knowing, um, more so than knowing, and how um, maybe one of the most fundamental things that we can be doing is to kind of ground things in like I guess, an Eastern spiritual perspective, that the more we can create karmically positive loops, the way that we relate to things, if we're relating things from the right place spiritually, from the right place in our own hearts and minds, that there's a patterning effect that creates, that influences the system, and that it's hard to know which touch point, like you mentioned, will make a difference. And I can point at a few of them, but I think more than anything, I would have some humility about exactly what that touch point is and have sensitivity. I think orienting ourselves towards keeping our apertures wide open to know the moment. It's more, there's a concept from um, John Vervaeke about sort of relationality in this, where what we want to do is, when we're dealing with a complex system rather than a complicated system, or kind of a system that's of a lower grade of complexity, where it's easy to kind of predict. You're playing tic-tac-toe or something, and you can kind of mathematically just plan out what you're going to do. What When you're playing soccer is required, there's a bit of long-term planning, but much more so than that is attunement. That your attunement to this moment and what needs to be said at any specific point in it is actually what increases your skillfulness in how you relate to noticing those moments as they arise. Um, I think that certainly there's some strategic analysis, like um, stakeholder analyses, I think are actually a fantastic way to kind of identify. And when you do kind of power mapping or something like that, you can identify, you know, that classic examples of the pillars that support power. If you can identify people that are on the crux of, if you could shift this person, it kind of tumbles that whole system. I think that there's certainly analysis of that sort that's helpful. And, in QEW, we've identified 30 or so congressional districts that we know we need to target to shift hearts and minds there, to shift what's happening in Congress. And just flipping a few votes could save these massive parts of legislation and shift the system downstream of it. Um, but yeah, I think that more than anything, I would support this deeper orientation, this kind of epistemic humility, attunement, and 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 the willingness to step out and do things. I think that one of the things that system needs most is people doing things that are radically courageous. And I think those sorts of actions, um, I kind of think in terms of like relatable examples. I think we're in a moment where, the world, you can imagine like a preschool classroom where everybody's screaming at each other, and there's maybe matches and gasoline on the floor, and it's, really nasty situation. And we need something to happen in the world right now that shocks people out of the maelstrom of the everyday and the petty grievances and the sense of, you know, well, it's, you did this and you did this, right? Blah, 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 blah. If we can do the kinds of actions that are so courageous that a hush falls over the room, I think that's the kind of thing that's most needed. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm attuning myself to it, and getting rid of the blocks in myself as much as I can to being willing to engage in that kind of courage. Yeah, Susan. Ron, did you have a follow-up at all before? Yeah.
Do you see that other religious communities might resonate with this message of a spiritual base, of transforming the inner the inner approach attitudes? Do you think that that's perhaps an audience or a ally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, a lot of the different languages we have about God is, it's kind of God in drag. Like we have, I think a lot of spiritual traditions, more mystically oriented spiritual traditions, kind of there's a broadening, and it's perhaps long held broad recognition of that. And that what is necessary is for us to do the kind of work that moves people out of sort of, I'll say fascistic forms of religion, which is what I mean by that is our people, our way of looking at things is right, and everybody else's way of looking at things is wrong. And, I think that that is fundamentally a basis um, for conflict and has been for thousands of years. But this other orientation that kind of recognizes that we have different language for speaking about the mystery, what ultimate reality, um, and that one's devotion to that when we start living our lives for something that was here long before we were born and goes on after us long after we're gone, that's the fundamental basis for a deeper existential sense of security and orientation towards a wiser way of relating in the world. And I think that there is broad common understanding of that, and especially I think about Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery, Plum Village, out in France, or something like that. That my experience talking to some of the engaged Buddhist community is they're right on board with Quakers on this kind of work, and there's many other avenues like that, and it's needed. I think that the main thing I would say is that the kind of courage that's necessary, um, something approximating what we would call spirituality, is probably necessary for that kind of courage. The kind of courage that's actually willing to give one's own life for something that's much broader and greater than themselves. That kind of courage, I think, is necessary, and spirituality is, however you conceive it, is the foundation for that. So we need to be working with spiritual communities.
Arnie wants to say something.
Yeah, I was just really struck by what Susan said, and I want to challenge and qualify what she said, because she was asking for, is the message going to be received, and do we have an audience? And I really want to strongly challenge that in the context of what you just said, of us really needing to be courageous. Because we're not looking for an audience as Quakers. We're not looking for people to listen to our messages. I think these kinds of conversation are taking place in all spiritual communities. And we're looking for leadership in order to do something. And this is where I want to challenge us. Let's identify what we're going to do, then start doing it, and then see how not audience, but co-workers will join us, who will join us in doing something, because we're all waiting. I mean, in my presentation last month, I said, we as Quaker organizations are funding the status quo with literally billions of dollars. instead of funding the new economy. Why? Because we don't have the courage to change it. And that absolutely includes myself. I've been scared to shit over the last weeks to actually do the next step. So I'm sharing this with you because I'm really longing for a group of friends to sit down and stop the talking. Yeah, we need to keep talking, but start the doing at the same time. And if it's the wrong thing, well, let's change course. Try it out, but we can't afford to be standing still. So I really want to challenge us to use the words that you've said, Keith, and what Susan has just said to
Mm.
bring this forth in me to move towards action. You know, we have all the words in the world. We need to start doing things with the situation. We're not doing enough as Quakers. And we have, I think, the history and the capacity and the courage in many examples to actually break free from that. So that was a call for help.
Amen. I I want to I'll just say I before taking this position at QEW, there was like a piece of me that was there's a little thing that never kind of came to full fruition, but I thought of something called trying to advocate for something called a Quaker simplicity pledge. And it was something about like basically, agreeing to say above a certain threshold of economic security, like we could debate on what that threshold is. Being part of being a Quaker is giving everything that's beyond that. And that would be pretty radical. I think we might lose a few Quakers on the path of saying that, but I think that we need a much, it's not just about moving our money. I think moving our money is important, but that's an aspect of it, right? We live in profoundly, I think we live in prophetic times. We live in existential times, and the call to conscience is proportional to the crisis that we face. If we're not stepping up to that, are we being faithful? Are we under the weight of that? Um, I think we should all be wrestling with those questions. And that, yeah, what you're saying, Aaron, yeah, let's make it tangible. Absolutely. We're at 11:35. Did we want to?
Yeah, do you want to try and get to some of these questions? At least one? I mean, we're not such a big group. I would suggest maybe we just, and they're big questions, um,
Yeah.
with big words. So maybe you could pick, I think we had thought question one or question three. I don't know if people want to vote on
Ron
which
helped me
question.
pare down my questions to two.
Okay,
And I think I'll just use Ron's questions here, if that's okay.
okay.
Because he helped me take the words that I was using and simplify, which I think is good. Um, do you guys mind if I just post both here in the chat for now, and but then we can maybe focus in on um, the first one?
Please.
So the first question is, what can we do to help build the political will locally and globally to overcome the resistance of vested interests and transform the prevailing economic and financial system? How can we build the political will? What are our levers there?
That's a teeny little question.
And the second question is, what steps could we take in the short term to promote a vision of an economic system favorable to life on Earth, life in its fullest?
I think we could just go ahead and just jump in. Jill, I saw you were trying to speak, but I think you're muted, or at least I don't hear you. There
It
you
was
go.
just a question whether we're going into groups.
Uh, I think we're small enough group that we'll just stay together.
Want to kind of state kind of a focus maybe on the first question. We are all living in different political contexts, mostly. And some of political contexts, I'm sure I'm rather unfamiliar with. I don't know much about the politics in the Netherlands, for instance. Um, I'm curious how you're seeing resistance to where are the vested interests and where is the sort of grassroots fear or resistance towards a more um, uh, transnational um, cooperation. Are there fears of groups, globalists in the UN, et cetera, or something of that sort? Um, how are we seeing those sorts of things crop up in our own communities? And how can we engage them?
Well, I'm speaking from the US, but I wanted to share a story of a meeting that I was in last week with the local um, interfaith justice coalition that kind of grew out of the Black churches in my city of Philadelphia. And our mayor has proposed a housing program that would involve borrowing $800 million from municipal bond brokers to support building housing. And these folks just didn't understand. They very much wanted to understand the financial implications of the difference between public money and private money, and they didn't have that information. And it was such a gift to be able to offer them information that they didn't have that helped them understand the financial interests that are at work in our city, as we try to pursue a goal that everybody wants, which is affordable housing. So I think there's a big opportunity to engage locally and see places where we can talk about, well, what does that look like here? What does that look like here in our city? What does it look like here? And how can we gather folks together to challenge that dominant paradigm that the vested interests get to have their say? So that was very hopeful to me, that they just needed a little bit of information and a bigger picture.
I've spent the last about 5 years kind of being part of the alarm, as a climate activist, of shrilling the alarm and trying to shake people up and wake them up, and got into considerable conflict with the law as a result of that. And I really feel quite strongly I need to move on from, I quote your words here, overcoming the resistance. I don't want to do that anymore, because we few 100,000 Quakers in this world, a few tens of Quakers who are, engaging in this conversation we are having here, um, we're too small against, those vested interests. They are just so huge. So that's for me a no-go. And what I've been thinking about for the last few months is, how can we actually live, work in a system, like realize a system which is just simply more attractive in many aspects. And I think that's not so difficult to achieve because the current system really sucks. It keeps distributing wealth to the few at the top and taking it from the poor. So given that we still mostly live in what we consider democracies, these are ideal conditions actually to bring about change. Um, where I see where most of us are being stopped, that, what I just said is that, bringing up the courage to make these bold steps, because we are, as human beings, we are conservative by instinct, by nature. Don't rock the boat if it's not yet sinking. Um, and I think we need to overcome that. And that is a huge challenge because, on the face of it, in everyday life, the current system works. It works quite well, bringing us closer to complete annihilate, you know what I want to say, and destruction. Um, we know that, but we are paralyzed to do something about it. So I really want to focus with my remaining professional life on building and living something which just, people look at and said, that makes so much sense. You know, let's do this. Let's copy this. Let's make it open code, let's have everyone start copying it. And I'm perfectly fine with the Quaker starting it, because if it actually works and we have the right values behind it to put in the checks and balances so it can work, we have experience with that in Quaker organizations to actually make sure that we don't mess up, that we have the right due diligence in this new system. And I think I'm inspired by this conversation tonight, but I think I'm speaking too much, so I want to give some space for others.
I resonate with what Arne says, but I'd like to leapfrog back to what Pamela was talking about. The I'm part of some listservs which have a lot of right-wing commentary, and I find this very instructive. And both through the terms, as the word fear is very, very, very significant in many of the um, postings. And what strikes me is the uninformation, the distorted information, the replication of misinformation, and the power of when somebody throws in the appropriately worded correct information. Word correct in the sense that it can be heard. It's using the language of the people who are expressing themselves in quite colorful language.
Feel called to just throw in a couple pieces that come up. One is, Aaron, what you were raising. I'm reminded of Buckminster Fuller's quote, where he says that if you're trying to change a system, don't fight the old system, build a new system that obsoletes the old one. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think there's power in it. There's a group that I spent some time with that got started in the United States around this idea of Game A being the current system that we're in, and Game B being a radically different economic and system. And one of the sort of design criteria there was around could it essentially, in some sense, outcompete or out attract people in a way that it sort of obsoleted the system that preceded it. I think that I'm still attracted to that ways of thinking, and I have some red flags come up for me around it, which are not they're not red flags, but they're these kind of like cautions. There's caution cones that show up around often what increases competitive advantage, often many things that allow us to be more competitive are actually about sacrificing moral values. And there are ways to do the opposite, but so often ethics are constraints on strategic possibilities, and the systems that are most strategically capable are those that are most least ethically constrained. Um, and so that's always going to be a challenge. Um, but I think one piece of shifting the underlying dynamics that I think create the system that we're in, going back to this question about overcoming resistance, I think it is about something different. Like shifting hearts and mind isn't always overcoming. But the kind of root piece of um, right-wing populism is a fear of change. And we live in a moment that I think if you don't have whiplash at the pace of history, you just haven't been paying attention. And if you're living in some part of the world that has been radically far away, rural to that change, it can feel very much like the world's moving on without you. And if you're on top of that, you're seen as backward. Your way of life that your family's been living for generations is seen as backward, non sort of detestable or looked down. It's something worthy of condescension, which many people feel that, whether it's evangelical Christianity in the United States or something like that, that the sort of progressive elites have decided that they're less than. And the more we can have compassion for people's that how fast that change has been for people, and creating bridges towards slow, that slow transformation, and not expecting that people just radically change overnight. I think is critical to what Susan was getting at, in finding the language that doesn't further that kind of polarization, but focuses only on those things that matter most, and finding solidarity around those things that we should all be able to agree on.
I think it's been really great talking and lots of commonality here. I come back to what you started with in a way, beginning, Keith, about peace and in general, what is it as Quakers that we bring to this rather than what do we think about the economics? And it feels to me that part of what we need to bring as Quakers is a shift to making the earth as our primary spiritual reference point, which it has not been. It's been humanity or justice or equality. And that if when I've done that, it has become immediately clear. If I say, well, what does the earth want? The earth doesn't want the war in Ukraine. It doesn't want us to be spending 5% of GDP rearming. And simplicity becomes a political act of witness through taking deconsumption into the belly of the market, whatever else happens. And equality becomes answering that of God in every thing as well as not just every one. And that truth is the truth that there is only one earth. And it's almost as if we wrote John 1 from in the beginning was the earth and the earth was with God. And that it's at that level that we have something to offer as Quakers, and out of which, through discernment, would come the things we need to do. Because just having that renewed Quakerism with earth as a primary reference point, spiritual reference point, is, as you were saying, Arnie, not enough. But we need to somehow combine the two. And the work is at least as much spiritual as it is political or economic or transformational.
Yes, building on from what Paul has said, and reflecting back on Susan's earlier question, what Paul has just said about spirituality and the relationship with the earth is something which would clearly resonate with many of our Eastern religious friends, more than with our Western Christian friends. So again, the possibility of building alliances on an interfaith basis among spiritually oriented faith groups, or the spiritual oriented individuals in all faith groups, I think has a lot of potential. And perhaps we need to try and think about the ways that we actually might try and do that in practice. On a more mundane note, I was just looking back at the question, and I think I would like to change one word in that question. It presently reads, what can we do to help build the political will locally and globally to overcome the resistance? So we should be talking about not trying to overcome, but to circumvent. And I think there's an awful lot and that we can learn from. That could lead to a lot of things. And it makes me think about a study or a summary of a study I read not long ago, somebody who was writing on some of these issues, in the New Economics Foundation in London a few years ago, realized that they'd been doing an awful lot of good work based on very good value systems and principles, and they'd achieved quite a lot. But it actually achieved nothing when it came to changing the system. And so they undertook they got somebody to do a serious study for them as to actually what made for systems change. And the conclusion that the study came up with was that all of the things that the NEF had been doing, all of the principles that they had built into their programs were valid, but they were not sufficient. And that I don't have the document in front of me at the moment, but they said that beyond what you'd already been doing, there were three things that were also necessary. And what it really amounted to was some action to subvert the existing system. So, as you were saying, Keith, build up the alternatives, demonstrate what else is possible. Absolutely. But at the same time, build in a few measures, just subvert the existing system. Subvert and circumvent.
I keep thinking of empty shelves in the United States, which will eventually happen. And I keep thinking of all the houses with all of the things in them. Obviously, some houses have more things in them than other houses, but I think people have been suffering from too muchism, like literally the weight of their stuff uh, weighing down on them. And I have I guess maybe naive ideas, but I have this idea of this sharing and trading economy that's going to flourish because everyone will realize, well, I don't know, I have enough Stanley Cups to keep me in Stanley Cups forever. Anybody need a Stanley Cup? And then, everybody will be bartering like crazy. And, I don't need to make light of what's going to be a difficult situation for people. But I do think that there will be some kind of a shift that's going to happen. I mean, I feel like people are, I don't know, maybe that whole scales falling from their eyes where it's like, gee, maybe capitalism wasn't all the stuff we got sold it was. It's not, I still can't make a living wage and my kids still can't get educated without going into hawk until their retirement age or, all of these things. So anyway, I just think that shift is going to come. It'll be interesting to see how creative we are and how loving we can be, and how it's going to be interesting. We're just a few minutes from 9 o'clock, so I was going to invite especially people who perhaps haven't said anything yet, to take the opportunity if you'd like to, before we end our evening together. Okay, well, I'd like to just draw attention to the chat where Pamela posted what the 3 elements are for system change. And we did record this, so somebody left early and I promised them they'd get the recording. Thank you, Keith, for your information. It's in the chat. And I hope we get a chance to work together again. It's I think the most inspiring thing is how you've managed to bring everything to, well, not everything, but many things together that, I think we're often so working in our silos, it's the environmental and it's the social and it's the spiritual people, and you managed to really make a circle around all of these things, encompassing these things. And I think you've given a lot of us much to think about and reflect upon. I want to thank you for that.
It's been a pleasure to be with you all. And yes, I was just called on what you were saying at the end, Rory, that I think that some degree of maturation is sort of always comes about when we face hard times. And that those things kind of necessarily mature us. And so it's, whenever you have stories, either individually or collectively, of great transformation, it's always some combination, addictive cycle or whatever it is, of catastrophe and grace. And so the more that we can add grace to that catastrophe, I think the better we're in. And it's wonderful to have allies such as yourselves in that. And I'm hoping we get to connect again. Please reach out to me via my phone or email. Happy to continue this.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Oh, our next one is, I don't have the date on hand. Ron?
Tuesday the 27th.
27th of May.
27th of May, and Pamela will be taking us through on, well, maybe you can explain yourself, Pamela.
I think maybe the quickest thing is the organizing around the difference between public finance and private finance.
Thank you. We look forward to that discussion in 3 weeks' time.